Today we are going to be looking at Alien Romulus, but first I want to start with a disclaimer. There are very legitimate complaints to be made about this film. There are definite pacing issues, some nonsensical scene breaks, and some leaps in logic which require the audience to just sort of go along with it and not think too much. All that being said, it's a step in the right direction, and I don't want anything I have to say here to push any of you who haven't seen it yet away from seeing it in the theater. It is in all of our best interest to see this film succeed. The more that this one stomps at the box office, the more I believe that the series will move in the right direction. Now, I think Fede Alvarez definitely bit off something larger than any other project he's worked on, and in part he succeeds brilliantly. But in others, I can see some of the issues caused by a less seasoned director taking the reins. That being said, we all know how timid Hollywood is, this being the first Alien project since Covenant, which brought home a total of just under $240 million against a $100 million budget. Even if you include marketing, the film did better than breaking even. And yet, even with Covenant doing better than breaking even, the studio still slinked away from any more Alien content for just over 7 years. Now we seem to be poised to receive quite a bit of Xenomorph content. With this new film, the upcoming TV series, and now rumors swirling around the possibility of more Alien theatrical sequels and maybe even an AVB crossover with the Prey director, this fandom is definitely being taken seriously by the money people. So, go out and see this one, despite its flaws. Celebrate the things about it that are awesome, and let the studios know your complaints and expectations going forward. To all the people who absolutely love this film, good on you. You probably shouldn't even watch this episode. We all have films that we absolutely love, despite storytelling issues or other complaints that can be made about the project. Sometimes because it hits us exactly at the right moment, and other times because it strikes an emotional chord. There are lots of reasons to love something that could still be improved upon. That being said, you're going to hear some legitimate complaints from the community. These come from a place of wanting to see the franchise do even better in the successive installments. I'm going to do this review in sections. Starting out, there will be no spoilers, and then I will have a giant flashing spoiler alert on the screen where I move into the territory of talking about very specific scenes. So if you haven't seen it yet, you can dip out at that point and come back and watch the rest of the review later. So, let's start out by discussing the things we absolutely know about the Alien lore, things that have become incredibly muddled over the successive installments, and have had to been sort of course-corrected in order for the series to make any sense. In the original Alien, the crew is woken up by the ship's computer to investigate what they are told is a distress beacon, but is later discovered to be a warning. The derelict ship they come across is the tomb of an unknown creature referred to by most official material as the Space Jockey. This creature is mummified and much larger than the humanoid engineers shown in Prometheus and Covenant, and it's in a state of decay, as well as rests in a run-down derelict ship, implying that it has been there for a long time. Remember that Covenant is only supposed to take place 20 years prior to the events of Alien. The Space Jockey shows clear signs of having been killed by a xenomorph erupting from its chest. A large hole in the floor of the chamber leads down to a room with thousands, if not tens of thousands of eggs, maybe even more because we never see how far the chamber actually stretches. The alien born from these eggs is the creature lovingly referred to as the Big Chap, which by this setup would predate any of the events in Prometheus or Covenant. Unless David the android is in the possession of a time machine, there is really no way he can be the architect of this situation. And this appears to be one of the larger things that the current stories course-correct and retcon away from Ridley Scott's proposed trilogy, both in Romulus and Alien Earth. I will talk about this in greater detail in the spoiler part of the Romulus review. Hovering slightly above the egg field is a blue laser that reacts to being touched. We never get an explanation for this, whether it's a security measure implemented by the Space Jockey or some unknown function by the Xenomorph hive, the latter being somewhat unlikely because we've never seen it in any other Alien film until Romulus. I'm going to get back to this question later. While exploring the egg chamber, the crew member Kane becomes host to the parasitic facehugger and gives violent birth to a Xenomorph, who, after erupting from Kane's chest, quickly sets out to stalk and eliminate the crew. As we proceed through Alien, it is found out that Ash, the ship's science officer, is actually an android who has been collating with the ship's computer mother behind the crew's back in order to protect and preserve the creature for the powerful Weyland-Yutani company, who presumably wants the creature for research and development, the crew unfortunately being expendable in this endeavor. Over the course of the film, the big chap lays waste to the entire crew, being finally blown out of the airlock of the escape pod Narcissus by Ripley after she sets the towing ship Nostromo and its payload on an irreversible self-destruct sequence. As was pointed out to me by another Alien fan, in my Romulus trailer review, I made the erroneous statement that the book describes the creature being blown out of the escape pod's thrusters 3 times in order to show its molting skin, and it turns out that I got this from a script I had purchased back in the late 80s from Golden Age Collectibles at Pike Place Market, who used to sell both real and questionable original scripts. The script I had bought had some things that were confirmed to have been cut out of the original screenplay, but other items may have been completely made up. It was a long time ago, and I misremembered where I had heard this, so take that one with a grain of salt. Anyway, back to the setup. The big chap was thrown from the Narcissus, having a spear gun bolt plunged into its chest as it attempted to save itself from being blasted out into space. Once outside the escape pod, the big chap climbed into one of the thruster ports, where Ripley started the ignition sequence, blasting the creature tumbling into the vastness of space. These are all of the things that you need to know going into Romulus. Though there's a nod to Prometheus and the Black Goo, it's not in any way important that you have seen either Prometheus or Covenant in order to understand what's going on in this film. At its core, Romulus is more about world building for the greater alien universe than it is about telling any individual story, as the eye of the plot seems to be more focused on explaining the how and the why rather than the who. The characters are relatively generic cannon fodder that you see throughout most slasher and horror science fiction storylines. You've got the tropey of mice and men sibling dynamic, where one is sharp and street smart and the other stumbles into problems being socially awkward and having mental acuity issues. Then you've got your generic poverty-class street rat characters that feel like the type of teenagers who probably inhabit the lower streets of Blade Runner. There isn't much depth to any of these characters, and their motivations are only slightly sprinkled in with cliché dialogue. These characters are also par for the course in horror and science fiction storylines. But seriously, the entire personality of one of the characters is simply that she's pregnant and a sister. The movie opens up with a probe exploring the debris field of the Nostromo. The probe comes across a meteorite that appears to be made of the same secreted resin the alien hives are made of. The meteorite is brought on board the probe, and it makes its way out of the debris field and into open space. I've heard quite a few people make the argument that there would be no debris left, but I disagree. Even after 3 thermonuclear blasts, there probably still would be chunks of the ship flung out into space, especially if the Nostromo ship itself were the center of the blast rather than its giant towing haul. Look at modern nuclear blast fields. They don't necessarily vaporize everything, and in space, debris tends to gravitate together. So with the alien being blown out of the Narcissus back towards the Nostromo, the idea of all of this debris coming together sort of like a comet makes sense to me. After the meteorite is retrieved, we get a montage sequence where the science crew personnel, some of which are dressed similar to the personnel arriving at the end of Alien 3, are prepping and dissecting the meteorite. We see the meteor being sliced in half, and the camera pans up into the upper half that's been lifted up, and we see a fossil-like impression of the big chap. The lower half, containing the creature, is being brought into a large white science lab. We then move to the atmospheric processing and mining colony, Jackson Star, where the protagonist, Rain Carradine, is literally dreaming of a better life. She awakens to a bleak, dreary colony life, where we are told that this portion of the planet has almost no sunlight, and the inhabitants are presumably the same type of rare element miners who would have loaded the cargo holds of the Nostromo. Rain, played by Kaylee Spaney, who plays her character very similar to Catherine Watterson in Covenant, is met by her brother, Andy, an android played by British actor David Johnson. Andy is a malfunctioning synthetic that was salvaged by Rain's father, who was scrapped due to damage in the mines. Andy has been programmed to be Rain's caretaker, but due to its damaged hardware, the roles have been reversed. Again, much like of Mice and Men, Andy is awkward and socially inept, constantly telling bad dad jokes and fretting over Rain's emotional state. The catalyst to the movie's events is Rain attempting to get off the colony world and out to the closest inhabitable system, which is 9 years away by cryosleep, a system which enjoys both sunrises and sunsets regularly. We find that the company has contracts which enslave its workers into outrageous work obligations that can be extended at the drop of a hat. Because of these stop-loss measures, Rain can't get out from under the contract that she's already fulfilled for yet another 5 years as it's been extended. To make matters worse, her parents both died of exposure to toxic elements in the mines. We see literal canaries in boxes being brought down into the shafts as dirty miners drag their feet in a slow trudge towards their shift. The colony is also riddled with the disease. The atmosphere and environment here is brilliantly orchestrated. The world feels akin to films like Blade Runner, Hardware, as well as the previous Alien films. While Rain was finding out that she has to fulfill another 5-year contract, her companion, Andy, was attacked by street urchins and goes into a convulsive state, which is evidently part of his flawed programming that needs to be reset by a Weyland-Yutani key every time it takes place. Andy is slow, kind, and likable, but also difficult to pin down as to where the ghost in the machine is. I think this is an interesting dynamic, but one that's not addressed in any comprehensive manner. But during this portion of the film, he has the likability and charm of Wally, or Data from Star Trek, a sort of Pinocchio-like innocence. And here's where I think the movie could have taken a beat and explored the world a little bit more thoroughly, cutting some of the exploration of the station in favor of world building, as the plot quickly moves Rain to her friends, who already have a plan to exit the planet and free themselves from the shackles of Weyland-Yutani servitude. Rain and Andy meet up with a ragtag group of colony misfits, consisting of Eileen Wu as Navarro, a bald-headed tough girl meant to evoke Ripley from Alien 3, in both costume and hairstyle. Isabella Merced as Kay, the plucky friend, sister to Tyler, and single mother-to-be. Spike Fern as Bjorn, the angry wise-ass who is hostile towards androids because his parents lost their lives in a mining accident due to the decisions of one. And lastly, Archie Renault as Tyler, the most mature member of the group, brother to Kay, and sort of ambiguous love interest, ex-love interest to Rain. Seriously, these two have about as much screen chemistry as a couple of co-workers who have never worked together before and probably aren't interested in ever working together again. Other than what I've stated here, there literally is nothing more to any of these characters, and none of them exude enough personality to really infer much else. We get a few lines from Archie Renault which suggest vaguely that he might have been interested in joining the Space Marines, but other than that, they're all pretty empty, and anything you bring away from them is something you probably brought in yourself. The crew has a puddle jumper ship, which could feasibly get them to the next system, except they don't have any cryopods. Luckily, they've discovered that a decommissioned Weyland-Yutani space station has gotten caught up in the planet's gravitational pull, and the crew has a limited amount of time to salvage a few cryopods before the doomed station is lost forever. But there's one catch. The crew needs a Weyland-Yutani android who can speak Mother in order to gain access to the station. So evidently, the company does not wipe their damaged androids' permissions before tossing them aside, and Andy still has full access to a highly clandestine secret laboratory. Almost immediately, we get a reverse dropship sequence where the crew breaks the planet's atmosphere and makes their way up into the derelict station. The special effects in this sequence are extremely well done, and the sound effects are muffled to imply the vibration inside of the ship rather than there being any sound in space, which I really like. Thanks to Andy, a few members of the crew make their way into the station, only to find out that the cryopods are low on cryogenic fuel, each pod only being able to last for around 3.5 years, and the journey will take about 9 years. It's during this sequence that we find out that Kay is pregnant, and Bjorn doesn't like androids because of what happened to his parents. Because of this, he taunts Andy incessantly, cruelly telling him that he will be decommissioned the second that they get to the next colony, as it's not currently under Weyland-Yutani control and doesn't allow their androids. But to this point, the audience really isn't set up to feel bad about this, as it's extremely vague as to whether Andy is sentient or not. Kay even going as far as to say it's fine, it's not like he's real, and Rain sort of shrugging her shoulders in agreement. So I would have liked to have seen a little more brother-sister setup here. Now, during the crew's first entry into the space station, it's set up that the anti-gravity generators are sort of kicking in and then turning back off, causing things to float up into the air and then slam back down on the ground. This simply can't have been happening station-wide, as there are objects set on desks that are full of liquid that likely would have spilled in that scenario. Andy finds a way to restore gravity shortly after this. The callbacks in this film have about all the subtlety of a pulse rifle blasting through an infirmary window, with scenes like this where Andy says, flat out, "I prefer the term artificial person." These callbacks and send-ups start to make the film feel a little more like a caricature of the franchise rather than its own film. So my non-spoiler portion of the review is that from this point forward, the heroes get stuck in a series of and then plot points, slowly trudging ground that we've seen many times before in a montage of alien film callbacks effects that don't amount to much that's really new. But the bigger issue is that to get to many of these set pieces and plot points, they implement leaps in logic that require quite a bit from the audience in order to keep moving forward. A good deal of the last act of the film will probably be spent by many of the audience members trying to connect the dots in order to understand what's happening and why it's happening. Don't get me wrong, there are some really cool moments and some great special effects. There are also some extremely poor special effects and some editing choices that have characters jumping from one point to another that are so jarring that you are actually thinking about what they were meaning to show you in the last sequence rather than what's actually happening in the current sequence. This happens more than once, and especially in the hallway and elevator sequences later in the story. I won't tell you in this sequence what happens in the end, but I will tell you that the horror first and Alien second fans are going to like it a lot more than the Alien first and horror second fans. And I like callbacks well enough, and I like it when films adhere to established rules and lore, but many of the callbacks in this film don't make a whole lot of sense in the moment. This isn't a spoiler, as it's been in many of the trailers, but you can see the Narcissus clearly, especially on larger screens, floating outside of the crashing space station. There's absolutely no reason for this. It's not Ripley's shuttle. It's not a shuttle at all. It's not a shuttle that was ever launched from the space station. As a matter of fact, by scale, it actually looks a little too large to be the Narcissus. Sure enough, it's right there on the screen. Why? Who knows? And the only reason I can come up with for this is that it's meant to be a, look, I hid an ET in the Senate George Lucas moment. It's just an Easter egg, and there are too many things in this film that are just Easter eggs, and don't do dual duty as plot points. So my overall rating for those who are not going to watch the spoiler section is that it's awesome to see the alien back on the big screen. It's also awesome to see that the film is doing well enough for the studios to take the property seriously again. There are definite issues with the storytelling, as well as the pacing, and a few scenes where the special effects look downright laughable. But it didn't ruin anything to the point where the series can't go forward because of being written into a corner. To me, this film doesn't look so much like a new entry into the Alien continuity as much as one of those filler episodes that sitcoms used to have, where they had a loose story based around rerun footage from previous episodes in order to save money. Now, for those of you who haven't seen it,
there'll be massive spoilers ahead.
After it's discovered how Bjorn's parents died, and that Kay is pregnant, and Andy is going to be decommissioned, the crew sets out to search the station for more cryogenic fuel. Before leaving the cryopods, Tyler ejects the low fuel beds into space to be picked up by the rest of the crew orbiting the station. As they travel down a hallway you will see many times throughout the film, Andy, Bjorn, and Tyler come across a room where there is an enormous hole melted in the floor, which even though he's being antagonized, Andy saves Bjorn from falling into, even after Bjorn threatened Andy with a cattle prod he just found. The badly damaged torso of an android sits at the corner of the huge open hole. No one decides to look up in this scene, even after seeing the hole in the floor, which is actually kind of ridiculous, as in a scene just a few minutes later, you find that there is something enormous hanging just above their heads. But I think their reason for this delay in the reveal is that the station's lights haven't been turned on yet. However, there's not a giant difference between the lit station and what we see in these scenes, as there's emergency lighting. And I kind of wish that the first exploration of the ship was done more by flashlight than emergency lighting, as many of the scenes seem too lit to build much tension. They are searching the station with flashlights, it's just that the scenes are brightly lit enough to see a lot of what's happening outside of the beam. Actually, I really would have liked to have had the spotlight be all we can see, similar to the submarine sequence in The Abyss. Afterwards, they make their way into a medical bay where there are facehugger parts in jars and on tables, parts that are obviously part of some mad science experiment. You can see that one of the facehugger fingers has giant glass-like spines sticking out of it. The team surmises that the cryo-containment fuel cells are in a room partially submerged in water. The group's theft of the cryo-containment fuel seems to release the vacuum-sealed facehuggers being kept in the room on ice. And the group's entry into this room also caused the door to jam mostly shut, but it's broken so it's open just enough to pass things through. Just too narrow for a person to get out. It's here that Rain and Navarro leave the ship after having successfully captured the ejected cryopods and make their way to the trapped crew members. Rain thinks that the disk in the damaged android can be used on Andy to give him greater control of the station functions. The tension in this scene is centered around a countdown that's happening as Tyler and Bjorn harvest the coolant. It's causing the room to heat up, allowing the facehuggers to escape their cryocontainment cases. Meanwhile, Navarro and Rain are scavenging the adjacent room with the damaged android. When Rain goes to pull the disc from the damaged android, it jolts back alive for a moment screaming, During this scene, Navarro finds an X-ray wand and pockets it for later. As the creatures are thawed out, they start dropping out of the pods and into the water, and begin swimming around the room, attacking Tyler and Bjorn. There's not one scene in this film where we actually see an egg. Every single facehugger is in a sort of vacuum-sealed briefcase. In the other room, Tyler and Bjorn furiously fight off springing facehuggers, who I'm just going to say are probably much weaker because of stasis, or maybe because they're different than the originals as they've been genetically engineered, rather than grown properly. Maybe this is the reason that the fingers have the 3 large spines at the end, in order to grab the head better, as they simply aren't that strong. But for whatever reason, these ones are far easier to smack out of the air than any that we've seen before. They're aggressive, but fairly easily punched away. I mean, it took 3 grown men to pull one off of Ripley, and Hudson seemed to be having a hard time holding just one of them pinned by the tail before blowing it apart with his pulse rifle. So again, for whatever reason, these ones are far weaker than what we're used to. There is a really cool sequence here where one crawls up Andy while he's rebooting and uses him as a springboard. It shows how they disregard the android completely. After Rain gets Tyler the disc and Tyler reboots Andy, who goes into a Weyland-Yutani reboot cycle, with his eyes rolling up into his head and his serial number being seen on one eyeball, and the Weyland-Yutani symbol seen on the other. The pair whacks and zaps, pursuing facehuggers with the cattle prod so many times in this sequence that it starts to feel a little comical, as if running out of energy is a way bigger threat than succumbing to the creature's aggression. Andy comes back online and opens the door, but hundreds of facehuggers start flooding out into the hallway and pursue Andy, Rain, Tyler, Bjorn, and Navarro into the adjacent room. They close the door quickly, but one facehugger makes it through and attaches itself to Navarro's head. Here the group tries to extract the creature, but it starts to strangle her in the process. Not sure what to do, the group decides to plug the damaged android into the ship's computer and ask it its opinion. Here we are treated to what I think may be the worst face swap render I have seen in a Hollywood film. The android that was lying on the floor is Rook, the same model as Ian Holmes' Ash in the original Alien, and he looks sort of like one of those singing baby face swap apps you see on commercials before TikTok videos. The teeth look terrible, the facial expressions are silly, the face warps badly in several instances. It makes me wish that they had done something more akin to how Alien 3 showed the badly damaged Bishop. And strap in, because Rook is not a bit player, and this is not just a one-scene cameo. They are going to be showing him throughout the entirety of the rest of the film. Luckily, most of the time from this point forward, you're going to be seeing him on a computer monitor, where the effect is a little more hidden, but it's pretty bad, and is something I think they could have blended better if the scene was darker. Rook is not so much a character as he is a walking exposition terminal. His entire purpose seems to be to provide plot points the protagonist couldn't figure out otherwise. Rook, the not-so-subtle nod to the chess-themed Bishop, explains that they were doing experiments on the big chap when he got out of control, and then tells the group to look up, where there is a dead big chap hanging just above their heads, caught up in the ship's wiring in sort of a cross pose. Then he basically says, read the prequel comic book and find out how we lost control of the station. They ask how they can get the facehugger off of their friend, and he sort of meanders around the question. Then one of them asks, what if we freeze its butt? And he's like, yeah, do that. They use some coolant to freeze the base of the tail, and the facehugger releases. Rook informs them that it's a 60-40 chance against her favor, that the creature already accomplished its purpose. Gone are the days of the slow burn gestation. Now facehugger to chestburster can be counted in minutes, not hours, or days. It's here where Andy starts to act differently. His mannerisms change from slow and sort of mentally deficient to hyper-aware and in charge. Rook informs the group that Navarro can't leave the station as she is potentially infected, and Andy concurs. Navarro wakes up, and Bjorn and her decide to sprint for the puddle jumper, while Andy attempts to chase them down and stop them from leaving. The sequence is a little confusing, but basically Bjorn and Navarro make it into the ship. Bjorn doesn't go any further than the airlock for some reason, but Navarro attempts to start the ship before the chestburster starts to erupt from her chest. Kay, who stayed on the ship because of morning sickness, is now trying to figure out what's happening to Navarro, who frantically uses an X-ray wand that she found in the medical bay while Ray was retrieving the disc. The chestburster pounds itself against her chest and then erupts in a sort of weird, awkward, peeking out from under a pie crust kind of way. And in the chaos, Navarro's flailing feet hit the joystick for the ship, and it goes tumbling around the station, smacking into everything as it goes, eventually knocking Kay out. I'm assuming Bjorn as well, even though we don't see what happens to him through this entire sequence. Or if we do, it's flashed on so quick that I didn't register it. On a side note, the chest burster in the sequence looks really good head-on, but for a split second they show its profile, and it looks exceedingly derpy. They kinda gave it a strange beluga whale with a slight underbite look. After the ships tumble around the station, it fortuitously comes safely to a rest in an open docking bay, where the doors automatically close and the room pressurizes after the ship comes to a gentle flat plane landing. From here on out, the film is going to be filled with more frantically pressing the door operation button than a 5-year-old at a slow crosswalk light. So after the team's ship safely crashes into the hangar bay, we spend the next several minutes following Tyler, Rain, and Andy through the station and towards the place where their friends crashed. Here we learn that the station has been thrown off kilter by the crashing shuttle, and now they no longer have ample time to get out, as a new countdown has started, which luckily is most of the runtime of the rest of the film. This puts us at about the 1 hour mark of the movie, so don't expect the Xenomorph to show up in any form until halfway through, other than the resin case big chap, and the dead big chap, and the plethora of facehuggers, and the eruption of the chest burster, that is. The chest burster being the first time we see a living Xenomorph in the whole film. At Andy's suggestion, the group decides that they have to match room temperature in order to move back through the facehugger-infested hallway. To be honest, I really don't like this thermal sensitivity mechanic, as I just don't think you could stay exactly room temperature while trying to cover the distance they needed to. And also, in previous films, the creatures have attacked spacesuits, and it was explained that the hive in Aliens was really warm, which means that if their environment reaches body temperature, they are suddenly blind to their prey. So it seems unlikely that they would set up in hot spots or humid environments if they were thermally activated. But the big issue I have with the scene is that unlike the previous facehugger attack sequence in the medical bay, which looked really good, this one relies heavily on practical effects, and there's one shot that just downright looks like a facehugger attached to an RC car. And a few of the other shots have the sluggish, repetitive motions of a Disney ride animatronic, and not one of the new ones, something from the 70s. And a lot of this could have been hidden with the old-school techniques of hiding the flaws of a thing in partial darkness and quick panning camera flashes. As I was watching this portion of the film, I realized that Alvarez has come up in an era of high-key lighting in order to have a lot of detail for post-production and digital effects. James Cameron and Ridley Scott both lit the creatures incredibly well, hiding a multitude of special effects scenes through quick cuts, moving shots, and spectacular cinema lighting. There are several scenes in the second half of Romulus that suffer from being overly lit, and the practical effects are the thing that suffers most from this. One thing I have to say that's sort of a disclaimer: I saw the film in a large laser IMAX auditorium, and unlike Dolby Vision and other formats, IMAX tends to be a much brighter image with a lot less contrast. While putting this video together, a lot of the scenes that I was scrubbing through looked much better on a calibrated smaller monitor, so I'm wondering how much of my personal impression of the film was altered by this experience. Here we switch back to Kay, who has woken up and is attempting to escape the crashed ship, where after finding the chestburster's shed skin, she quickly runs into Bjorn, cattle prod still in hand, who urges her to be quiet as they approach a large, undulating vaginal pod stuck to the side of the wall. This is a prop that I wish was a little more darkly colored, like the resin the aliens create, more like something you would see in Species, but it was relatively fleshy with more pink tones than I would have expected. It also was again fairly brightly lit, so it was easy to see it against the backdrop of the wall. This is a newly revealed part of the alien's life cycle. Presumably, the big chap went through the same pupal stage before growing into something much larger, and we kind of see something like this implied in the air shaft sequence in Alien 3. So we now have a pupal growth stage to add to the canon. Bjorn walks up and shoves the cattle prod into the undulating vaginal opening. Bjorn zaps the gestating creature several times, seeming to actually damage it, while Kay runs to the opposing door. As Kay attempts to escape, Bjorn is struck in the face with the alien's tail, which looks at first like it killed him outright, but when he falls to the ground, you barely see any scratch on his face. Acid starts pouring out of the wall pod's cavity and burning Bjorn in the chest and face. In the scene, he doesn't scramble at all to get out from under the dripping acid, but just kind of keeps wiping at it from his chest, disintegrating his hands. And the acid keeps falling, ending in a sort of confusing explosion of Bjorn's chest. I'm assuming this is supposed to be because one big glob of acid hit him, but the effect looks like something actually explodes. The alien then emerges from the pod and sort of unfurls itself. Kay, still frantically trying to open the door, falls about 1.5 stories to the floor when it finally opens, largely because the ship's door is not synced up with any walkway due to the way the ship came to a rest in the hangar. She crawls under the floor grating, where the newly grown Xenomorph lands on the floor above her with a heavy thud. Because of the cattle prod, this one now has a large scar on the side of its head. In several scenes, it appears to have an electrical current inside the dome, but there's never any explanation given for this. happens, nor is the effect ever shown in enough detail to know if that's actually what you're seeing. However, I will say that the scene is probably the best the Xenomorph looks in the entire film. But something really confusing happens next. The creature calls off its pursuit, and you can see it in the corner of the room dragging two bodies up into the rafters. There's never any explanation given as to why it's dragging two bodies off, or who they are. My assumption is that it's Bjorn and Navarro, but Navarro is definitely dead, and Bjorn looked pretty dead in his final sequence. The director just never commits to any reason for the bodies being taken away. So it left me with a distinct feeling that there's a missing scene here, and I feel there were a couple scenes that suffer from this problem. Just jarring jumps in pacing. During this sequence, Andy, Rain, and Tyler are communicating with Kay, which causes Tyler to freak out enough to change his movements and body temperature, of course causing the facehuggers to resume their attack posture. The team runs frantically for a closable door, where Andy nearly shuts Tyler outside with the pursuing creatures. This is where we begin to see Andy's priorities regarding protecting the group might be altered. After the scene, Kay meets with Andy, Tyler, and Rain, but they are separated by another non-working door. There's definitely some video game logic going on here, as Kay hasn't yet found the key with a carving of armor, but what happens next is maybe one of the most well-executed scenes in the film. The Xenomorph crawls down and sits on a machine behind Kay, while the android refuses to override the door from the other side, knowing full well that should the door open, the creature will get all of them. I really like the idea that the Xenomorph is laying a trap. Ultimately, Andy refuses to open the door, and when the Xenomorph realizes this, he impales Kay and takes off with her. This is the point at which Rain fully realizes that Andy's prime directive of protecting her has been overridden by the company, asking Andy flat out his core directive, to which he admits it is now do what's best for the company. It's from this point forward that the film just sort of follows video game logic. They then make their way into the giant laboratory you saw at the beginning of the film, on the Romulus side of the station, having started out on the Remus side. Just so everyone knows, the Romulus and Remus aspects of the film don't have much bearing on the plot whatsoever. They could have just called it Alien Renaissance, as there really isn't anything special about the Romulus side of the station. They were doing an equal amount of research on both sides. And to be honest, things don't look that technologically different from one side to the other. Here they find a laboratory where there is a huge exposition dump, which both pays tribute to and cancels out some of the events of Prometheus and Covenant. The android Rook explains via conference call that the Xenomorph holds an adaptive type of DNA that may assist humanity in terraforming planets and allow humanity to become a more robust spacefaring race. So the implication is that the engineers were using the Xenomorph DNA, and that David was simply trying to refine the DNA back to the base organism. However, in an interview, Fede Alvarez makes a statement about the engineers having been produced by the black goo as well. So who knows, maybe the inference is supposed to be that the space jockeys found the alien, messed with its DNA, and created the engineers, who in turn created humanity. Any way you look at it, this is something that will have to be more greatly explored in the Alien Earth TV series, which features a full-blown Xenomorph, but takes place long before even Prometheus. Noel Hawley having explicitly stated that his take will feature an evolutionary origin to the Xenomorph. Ridley Scott will also be writing one entire episode of Alien Earth, so it's possible that whatever his plan was for the third installment of the prequel trilogy will find its way into that storyline. On one of the screens in the lab, we see a video of a laboratory rat being crushed and then revived with the black goo mutagen. It's quickly explained that this is a miracle cure, and Andy is to procure a sample and bring it back to the colony for further research. In this scene, we also learn that the Xenomorph is actually the creature's official name, and not merely a scientific term being used by the Colonial Marines. Xenomorph XX-121 to be precise, which has been used in expanded universe material, but never explicitly mentioned in any of the films. So now it's official. As we're leaving, the camera pulls back and reveals that the lab rat eventually mutated into a giant hideous Resident Evil abomination. And the reason the group had decided to move forward rather than go back the way they came is that the Scorch alien is waiting in the hallway going back to their ship. The group goes to an armory where Andy outfits them with 2 proto-pulse rifles that have the ability to aim assist. Tyler explains that he knows how they work because of magazines and videos, which lends more credence to the idea that he really wants to be a Colonial Marine. So our heroes make their way forward into a hallway that appears to be completely overtaken by a hive, their plan evidently being to traverse the bottom deck of the station and then make their way back up to the ship on the other side. However, they are warned by Andy that their guns are for show alone, in a callback to the "what are we supposed to do, use harsh language" scene in Aliens. The reason they can't use their guns is that they are too close to the bottom deck of the space station, and the acid will most likely eat straight through into open space. But Andy figured that the aliens are smart enough to recognize the pulse rifles as a threat and back off. This, to me, is one of the more stupid hat tricks in the entire film. In previous films, we've seen the Xenomorphs openly attack direct threats in order to overwhelm their defenses. I've seen some people say that these are drones, so they are more cautious, but there's a scene later on towards the elevator where they all just run headlong into death. The fact that this would work comes across as really silly. Recognizing the hive in the hallway, Andy suggests that the group go back and find another route. But Tyler hears his still-alive sister yelling out from deep inside the hallway. And I think that there's an enormous missed opportunity here. The lab should have had an observation room where the alien hive began in a controlled setting, and signs that they had obviously lost control and that the hive spread outside the observation room and into the hallways, showing us more hints on how they lost control of the station. But I guess I'll have to read the comic book. But overall, I think that would have been a better segue from laboratory to alien environment. As the group moves forward, we see dead lab technicians and spent facehuggers lying next to them, implying that they are more than just the scarred Scorch alien lurking around the corridors. Scorch being a creature that really has had no effect or bearing on the plot whatsoever, and in the next sequence really ends up blending in with all the other Xenomorphs. So if you had any ideas about this one being sort of like Blue in Jurassic World or the grid alien in AVP, nix that thought right now. It's simply there so that you can show the life cycle of this particular breed. Now, I'm fairly sure this is because of budget, but the hive sequence does really seem like just one small corridor of the hallway, and doesn't really present any sense of scale. It's here the group finds the still-living Kay, but she is badly injured, which Andy surmises is the reason that she hasn't yet been implanted. This kind of irks me, as there are a couple scenes where the alien skewers someone who isn't an immediate threat, rendering them unusable for breeding. In Aliens, even in the heat of battle, the creatures are dragging the still-living Marines off for implantation. But the issue is that they wanted you to believe that Kay was dead, so that a reveal in this scene would have more weight. And of course that there would be a significant reason for her to even want to inject herself with the black goo. After pulling her off the wall, Andy immediately starts pushing hard for Rain and Tyler to inject Kay with the ampules he has procured from the lab. We, the audience, know this is because he wants to get the fluid off the station in a living host. But in the scene, he's acting like it's for altruistic reasons. A short argument ensues, and the group ultimately decides against injecting Kay. Before proceeding deeper and following his friends into the hive, Andy leans down to inspect the same blue laser beam we see in the original Alien. It even reacts to his touch with a similar sound effect. I'm fine with callbacks as long as there's a reason, and this only seems to serve the purpose of getting us to think about the first film. There's no explanation or greater lore it creates regarding why it's also found on a space station. Again, who knows? Personally, I always had the feeling that the blue beam was more of a security measure set up by the space jockey than anything to do with the alien itself. Either way, it's still a mystery. In the next portion of the hallway, the group is attacked by several Xenomorphs. Andy goes on the fritz, and Tyler is impaled and drug up into the rafters trying to protect Rain and Kay, where he is attacked by several Xenomorphs while yelling Space Marine bravado, yet not firing his pulse rifle, just sort of pointing it at them and yelling. It comes across as a lot less cool than it should have. Tyler is killed by an inner jaw to the top of the head, and I've heard people make the statement that he went out like a brave hero, but honestly, he had so little personality that I didn't feel any way about it at all. His sudden death just meaning I had less people to keep track of. I was just sort of disappointed we couldn't see it better. During the scene, I kept thinking about the Futurama episode with the Neutral Society, and hearing him say, "If I die, tell my wife hello." Rain, still looking bored as ever, takes off with Kay towards the elevator. Seriously, these kids have never seen anything like this, and yet their reactions are largely like Disney ride employees pulling down the pull bar on the 10,000th customer. In the first film, all of the characters looked like they were in shock, functional but deeply traumatized. But here they mostly look sweaty and slightly put out. There are a few jump cuts here that make it hard to figure out what's supposed to be happening from scene to scene. It's not impossible to follow or anything. The scenes are just very poorly spliced together. There's little to no flow frame to frame in this scene, and I'm wondering if certain things were left on the cutting room floor, or if they were just splicing things together quickly to hide effects and reuse scenes. And it's hard to discern exactly where the threats are coming from because there are a lot of close-ups of alien faces shooting out their inner mouths, but very little that pulls back and shows us the whole scene. This would have been an awesome sequence for them to showcase the full full-body animatronic that was built for the film. And from the trailers, I really expected a lot of this film to be about the Scorch alien stalking the crew. But again, he really barely makes any appearance. Rain gets Kay to the elevator and asks her if she can manage the rest of the way to the ship, giving her the mutagen for safekeeping. Kay agrees to go it alone, and Rain runs back to reset Andy to bring him to safety. This scene is filmed nearly identically to the way Ripley came after Newt, so I guess Andy is Newt in this situation. Halfway up the elevator shaft, Kay says screw it and injects herself with the mutagen, largely because of the huge gaping hole in her side where the Xenomorph impaled her. Again, we are dealing with a Xenomorph that is stupid enough to give her a mortal wound and then still cocoon her, even though it decides she's too far gone for a facehugger. My headcanon is just going to say that Bjorn did some serious brain damage to this beast when he zapped it, so there are both questionable character and Xenomorph choices in this film. Rain reboots Andy, taking out the disc that caused him to prefer Weyland-Yutani prime directives, but we don't quite get the lovable on-the-spectrum dork from the beginning, as Andy keeps a few of his upgrades. Now, I watched Grace Randolph's review, and she read quite a bit of romance into Andy and Rain's relationship. Did anybody else see that? Because I certainly didn't. As a matter of fact, I think reading that much sexual tension into a brother-sister dynamic is pretty concerning. Anyway, the station is now perilously close to destruction, and Rain and Andy become cornered by a huge group of Xenomorphs. And by huge, I mean a group of guys standing outside of a 7-Eleven trying to figure out where the party is. We get a call from Uncanny Valley Rook, where he regurgitates Ash's line, "You have my sympathies." It's here where Rain figures out that she can turn off the ship's gravity and safely kill all of the approaching creatures because, exploding acid in zero gravity will stay away from the walls instead of flow with the trajectory of its initial thrust. Rain runs the pulse rifle down to 1 bar, killing Xenomorph after Xenomorph, leaving floating trails of acid that are magically not spinning outwards towards any of the walls. Now, here it gets kind of confusing as to how many rounds the pulse rifle can carry, as they run the rifle down to 1 bar. I say bar because the rifle starts out with bars of ammo rather than a numeric value being counted down. And all I could think of for the rest of the film was that episode of Seinfeld where Kramer is trying to see how far he can get a test drive car to go on the freeway while the gauge is on empty. As every scene after this one, you expect for there to be a moment where the gun goes click click and the hero has run dry. Yet, really, the last bar must actually represent most of the ammunition, as they fire it almost as much from here on out as they did in that last sequence. Rain and Andy make their way through the acid blood trail, Rain heroically telling the synthetic with amazing reflexes to stay behind her for safety. Here and there, she uses the pulse rifle to redirect herself and escape the floating acid. They make their way safely to the elevator shaft where Rain is being followed by facehuggers who call off their pursuit because they see that she has closed a gate with giant holes they could easily fit through. The Xenomorph grabs Ray's shirt and she blasts it, suddenly not caring at all for the acid eating through the hull. Rain and Andy make their way up the elevator shaft in zero gravity when out of nowhere the gravity generators suddenly kick back in. This is where all that acid floating in the air in the chamber below should have hit the ground and created a giant vacuum inside the elevator shaft. It does make it a little windy, but nothing like what you would expect sudden violent decompression to be like. Rain falls down the elevator shaft, but is caught by the Scorch alien, who again appears to have electrical burst happening inside the scar of its dome. Why? Who knows? The reason Scorch Alien doesn't kill her outright is that it's summoning a facehugger from the corner. An elevator comes flying by and saves the day. Andy jumps down from above, firing the pulse rifle and blowing apart the Scorch Alien all the way down to the ground, yelling out a victorious, "Get away from her," massive pause, "You bitch." Kind of like the wheelchair kid in Malcolm in the Middle. This pulverized alien probably should have eaten right through the subfloor, blasting the vacuum of space into the elevator chamber, but they yada yada yada'd out into the next scene. Honestly, that callback line from Aliens got the biggest groan from the audience I was in, so it definitely wasn't well received everywhere. Rain and Andy make their way back to the shuttle, and then safely launch themselves out of the falling space station as it smashes into the rings of the planet. There's a wide shot where you can very obviously see the Narcissus flying away from the Renaissance station. Parallel to the ship Rain and Andy are piloting can be seen. There's no reason for this to be there, other than it's an Easter egg. We get a shot of Rook being ripped out of the station while it's coming apart, and that's about all she wrote for the adventure. At least I wish it was. Really, I could have forgiven all of the ridiculousness in that last sequence, but the end is what ruined this film for me the most. I can feel Ridley Scott's sticky little black goo-covered fingers all over it, and it's a sequence that really took the film away from being a truly alien entry. And I was truly hoping that we were just going to find that the Scorch alien is something new in the alien life cycle, anything from a Praetorian to a molting queen, but instead we get a body horror pregnancy sequence. Because, of course we do. While Rain is closing the cryosleep chamber door on Kay, she sees something is wrong and opens the chamber back up. Kay goes into convulsions, and her stomach starts swelling rapidly, immediately leading to her giving birth to a large, undulating pod. Rain grabs the pod like a football and takes off with it until it starts burning her hands and she's forced to toss it onto the ground. Rain looks like she's about to try to crush the pod when it splits open, revealing a strange white infant. Now the pod is full of acid and burns its way through the floor onto a mound of some sort of mining sand that neutralizes the acid. The creature that crawls out of the pod quickly grows into a hybrid of an engineer and a Na'vi from Avatar, except with a large starfish-like butthole on its crotch. The entire sequence is ripped right out of Alien Resurrection, but somehow done slightly worse. It's also been noted by Fede Alvarez that in the original script, Bjorn was the father of Kay's child. Since he was her first cousin, the kid already had a pretty good chance of being a flipper baby, so maybe the black goo was just working with what it had. And this leads me to a secondary issue I had with the film overall, which is that a lot of the story is being related to us by Alvarez after the fact, but didn't end up on the screen. I'm kind of hoping that there's a huge director's cut on its way later this year. The giant thumb-headed creature thrashes around and knocks Andy out of commission. Again, it then circles back around and attempts to feed on its mother, who is now producing Ghostbusters slime from her breasts. I think in this scene, the creature is supposed to be milking her dry, but it's really hard to tell the way that it's shot. But decides that this is not what it wants, and presumably kills her. This thing doesn't really resemble a xenomorph at all. Other than some stubby tubes on its back and tail, it looks far more like an engineer. I think the idea here was to have a creature similar to creatures like the thing you see at the end of the zombie film Record, but honestly, it comes off as far too stupid looking to be frightening, and doesn't at all pay service to the rule of cool. If this thing looked just a little bit awesome, I probably could have stomached this sequence better, but I'm kind of tired of sickly looking abominations coming from the perfect organism. I much would have rather this look like something out of Species rather than a sickly white thumb-headed butthole crotch. But to each his own, I guess. While Kay is being savaged to death by her offspring, Rain gets herself into a spacesuit, calling back from the original alien, but much more clothed while doing so. And I can't remember, but I think she actually turns to the screen here and does an over-exaggerated wink like the kid in A Christmas Story. But don't quote me on that, I can't be sure. She takes some of the acid from the pod and spills it onto the floor of the ship while attaching herself to a tow cable. The entire chamber decompresses, and her and the mound of sand are sucked into space. While she flails like a fish on a hook, the creature comes for her and attempts to puncture her space helmet with its semi-flaccid inner mouth. Rain decouples the cargo container from the main ship, sending the creature and the container careening into the rings of the planet, allowing Rain to pull herself back up the tow cable and back into the main body of the ship. This entire sequence was as disappointing as it was incredibly boring. It wasn't visually interesting, nor was it even needed. In fact, I really wish they just let Kay go to sleep and dealt with what she had done in the sequel. After the chaos, we get a voiceover sequence where Rain closes down shop by making a final log entry, similar to the final scene in Alien. And that's actually all she wrote. The final creature was played by Robert Bobrotsky, a 7-foot, 7-inch tall Romanian basketball player who did a serviceable job with what he was given. But I really believe that there's a lot more they could have done with someone with such a tall and interesting frame. So in the end, you have a giant alien newborn who only has a couple minutes of screen time and then is sucked out into space. Again, it's a greatest hits collection. And strangely enough, Alvarez is claiming ignorance as to the similarities between this ending and Resurrection. It's very possible that he was just simply too close to the project to see how ham-fisted a lot of the parallels were. The building blocks are definitely there. I would say that despite a few in-your-face nostalgia moments, the overall tone of the film for the first hour was really strong. But the movie starts to fall apart in the second hour, largely because it moves from exploratory storytelling into urgency-based storytelling. And at that point, the writers were having a hard time finding reasons to move the characters from one point to another. Remember that none of these characters had ever seen anything like this before, and yet they barely even discuss what's happening. The film just moves them through their paces to their inevitable fate. And honestly, the mad science experiment trope is wearing a little bit thin. I want to see an alien film where the xenomorphs overwhelm a population without the aid of Resident Evil-like mutations. I was hoping for a flat and dry alien film. Heck, I would have been happy if the Scorch alien was the only xenomorph in the entire movie. In the end, this is an okay entry, but definitely not my third favorite, as I still believe Alien 3 is actually a much stronger and more coherent film. Going forward, I'm hoping Noah Hawley has an easier time fighting off Ridley Scott's advances, and sticks to his guns in resetting the Xenomorph's origin. But all these complaints aside, I completely see that Alvarez is a mega fan, and though I think there are a couple of missteps here, I do commend him on bringing the series back and trying his hardest to please everyone, including Ridley Scott. He had an impossible task, and though this one is not without its flaws, the Alien franchise seems to be back for the foreseeable future due to him. So, definite credit where credit is due. Like I said before, don't let my review stop you from seeing the film, and those of you who enjoyed it more than I did, I appreciate you for keeping the property afloat by singing its praises. In the near future, I'm thinking about doing a video regarding my unifying theory of everything in the Alien universe. Hit me up in the comments and let me know if this is something you'd like to see. This is Strange Form, signing off. And remember, never stop collecting.